The Hellbound Heart, Chapter 7.
Kirsty? Is that you? Yes? Who is this? It's Rory.
The line was watery, as though the deluge outside had seeped down the phone. Still, she was happy to hear from him. He called up so seldom, and when he did, it was usually on behalf of both himself and Julia. Not this time, however. This time, Julia was the subject under discussion.
There's something wrong with her, Kirsty. I don't know what. Ill, you mean? Maybe. She's just so strange with me. And she looks terrible. Have you said anything to her? Well, she said she'd fine, but she isn't. I wondered if maybe she'd spoken with you. I haven't set eyes on her since your housewarming. That's another thing. She doesn't even want to leave the house. That's not like her. Well, do you want me to have a word with her? Would you? I don't know if it'll do any good, but I'll try. Don't say anything about me talking to you. Of course not. I'll call in at the house tomorrow.
Tomorrow. It has to be tomorrow.
Yes, I know.
I'm afraid I'll lose my grip, Julia. Start slipping back.
I'll give you a call from the office on Thursday. You can tell me what you make of her.
Slipping back?
They'll know I've gone by now.
Who will?
The gash. The bastards that took me.
They're waiting for you?
Just beyond the wall.
Rory told her how grateful he was, and she in turn told him that it was the least a friend could do. Then he put down the phone, leaving her listening to the rain on the empty line. Now they were both Julia's creatures, looking after her welfare, fretting for her if she had bad dreams. No matter, it was a kind of togetherness. The man with the white tie had not bided his time. Almost as soon as he set eyes on Julia, he came across to her. She decided, even as he approached, that he was not suitable. Too big, too confident, after the way the first one had fought. She was determined to choose with care. So, when White Tie asked what she was drinking, she told him to leave her be. He was apparently used to rejections and took it in his stride. Withdrawing to the bar, she returned to her drink. It was raining heavily today, had been raining now for 72 hours on and off, and there were fewer customers than there had been the week before. One or two drowned rats headed in from the street, but none looked her way for more than a few moments. And time was moving on. It was already past 2. She wasn't going to risk getting caught again by Rory's return. She emptied her glass and decided that this was not Frank's lucky day. Then she stepped out of the bar into the downpour, put up her umbrella, and headed back to the car. As she went, she heard footsteps behind her. And then White Tie was at her side and saying, "My hotel's nearby." "Oh," she said, and kept on walking. But he wasn't going to be shrugged off so easily. "I'm only here for 2 days," he said. "Don't tempt me," she thought. "Just looking for some companionship," he went on. "I haven't spoken to a soul." "Is that right?" He took hold of her wrist, a grip so tight she almost cried out. That was when she knew she was going to have to kill him. He seemed to see the desire in her eyes. "My hotel?" he said. "I don't much like hotels. They're so impersonal." "Have you got a better idea?" he said to her. She had, of course. He hung his dripping raincoat on the hall stand, and she offered him a drink, which he welcomed. His name was Patrick, and he was from Newcastle. "Down on business. Can't seem to get much done." "Why's that?" He shrugged. "I'm probably a bad salesman. Simple as that." "What do you sell?" she asked him. "What do you care?" he replied, razor quick. She grinned. She would have to get him upstairs quickly before she started to enjoy his company. "Why don't we dispense with the small talk?" she said. It was a stale line, but it was the first thing that came to her tongue. He swallowed the last of his drink in one gulp and went where she led. This time, she had not left the door ajar. It was locked, which plainly intrigued him. "After you," he said when the door swung open. She went first. He followed. This time, she had decided there would be no stripping. If some nourishment was soaked up by his clothes, then so be it. She was not going to give him a chance to realize that they weren't alone in the room. "Going to fuck on the floor, are we?" he asked casually. "Any objections?" "Not if it suits you," he said, and clamped his mouth over hers, his tongue frisking her teeth for cavities. There was some passion in him, she mused. She could feel him hard against her already. But she had work to do here, blood to spill, and a mouth to feed. She broke his kiss and tried to slip from his arms. The knife was back in the jacket on the door. While it was out of reach, she had little power to resist him. "What's the problem?" he said. "No problem," she murmured. "There's no hurry here. We've got all the time in the world." She touched the front of his trousers to reassure him. Like a stroked dog, he closed his eyes. "You're a strange one," he said. "Don't look," she told him. "Huh?" "Keep your eyes closed." He frowned, but obeyed. She took a step backwards towards the door and half turned to fumble in the depths of the pocket, glancing back to see that he was still blind. He was, and unzipping himself as her hand clasped the knife. The shadows growled. He heard the noise. His eyes sprang open. "What was that?" he said, reeling round and peering into the darkness. "It was nothing," she insisted as she pulled the knife from its holding place. He was moving away from her across the room. "There's somebody..."
Don't.
"Here." The last syllable faltered on his lips as he glimpsed a fretful motion in the corner beside the window. "What in God's..." he began. As he pointed into the darkness, she was at him and slicing his neck open with a butcher's efficiency. Blood jumped immediately, a fat spurt that hit the wall with a wet thud. She heard Frank's pleasure and then the dying man's complaint, long and low. His hand went up to his neck to stem the pulse, but she was at him again, slicing his pleading hand. His face. He staggered, he sobbed. Finally, he collapsed, twitching.
Good woman.
Was it her imagination, or was his voice already stronger than it had been? more like the voice she'd heard in her head 1,000 times these plundered years. The doorbell rang. She froze. "Oh, Jesus," her mouth said.
It's all right, Julia. He's as good as dead.
She looked at the man in the white tie and saw that Frank was right. The twitching had all but ceased.
He's big and healthy.
He was moving into her sight, too greedy for sustenance to prohibit her stare. She saw him plainly now, for the first time. He was a travesty, not just of humanity, of life. She looked away. The doorbell was ringing again, and for longer.
Go and answer it.
She made no reply.
Go on.
Turning his foul head in her direction, his eyes keen and bright in the surrounding corruption. The bell rang a third time.
Your caller is very insistent. I really think you should answer the door.
She backed away from him, and he turned his attentions back to the body on the floor. Again, the bell. It was better to answer it, perhaps. She was already out of the room and trying not to hear the sounds Frank was making. Better to open the door to the day. It would be a man selling insurance, most likely, or Jehovah's Witness with news of salvation. Yes, she wouldn't mind hearing that. The bell rang again. "Coming," she said, hurrying now for fear he'd leave. She had welcome on her face when she opened the door. It died immediately. "Kirsty? I was just about to give up on you. I was asleep." "Oh." Kirsty looked at the apparition that had opened the door to her. From Rory's description, she'd expected a washed-out creature. What she saw was quite the reverse. Julia's face was flustered. Strands of sweat-darkened hair glued to her brow. She did not look like a woman who had just risen from sleep. A bed, perhaps, but not sleep. "I just called by," Kirsty said, "for a chat." Julia made a half shrug. "Well, it's not convenient just at the moment," she said. "I see. Maybe we could speak later in the week?" Kirsty's gaze drifted past Julia to the coat stand in the hall. A man's coat hung from one of the pegs, still damp. "Is Rory in?" she ventured. "No," Julia said. "Of course not. He's at work." Her face hardened. "Is that what you came round for?" she said. "To see Rory?" "No, I... You don't have to ask my permission, you know. He's a grown man. You two can do what the fuck you like." Kirsty didn't try to debate the point. The vault face left her dizzied. "Go home," Julia said. "I don't want to talk to you." She slammed the door. Kirsty stood on the step for half a minute shaking. She had little doubt of what was going on. The dripping raincoat, Julia's agitation, her flushed face, her sudden anger. She had a lover in the house. Poor Rory had misread all the signs. She deserted the doorstep and started down the path to the street. A crowd of thoughts jostled for her attention. At last, one came clear of the pack. How would she tell Rory? His heart would break. She had no doubt of that. And she, the luckless tale teller, she would be tainted with the news, wouldn't she? She felt tears close. They didn't come, however. Another sensation, more insistent, overtook as she stepped onto the pavement from the path. She was being watched. She could feel the look at the back of her head. Was it Julia? Somehow she thought not. The lover, then. Yes, the lover. Safely out of the shadow of the house, she succumbed to the urge to turn and look. In the damp room, Frank stared through the hole he had made in the blind. The visitor, whose face he vaguely recognized, was staring up at the house, at his very window indeed. Confident that she could see nothing of him, he stared back. He had certainly set his eyes on more voluptuous creatures, but something about her lack of glamour engaged him. Such women were, in his experience, often more entertaining company than beauties like Julia. They could be flattered or bullied into acts the beauties would never countenance, and be grateful for the attention. Perhaps she would come back, this woman. He hoped she would. Kirsty scanned the facade of the house, but it was blank. The windows were either empty or curtained. Yet the feeling of being watched persisted. Indeed, it was so strong, she turned away in embarrassment. The rain started again as she walked along Lodovico Street, and she welcomed it. It cooled her blushes and gave cover to tears that would be postponed no longer. 3. Julia had gone back upstairs trembling and found White Tie at the door, or rather his head. This time, either out of an excess of greed or malice, Frank had dismembered the corpse. Pieces of bones and dried meat lay scattered about the room. There was no sign of the gourmet himself. She turned back towards the door, and he was there, blocking her path. Mere minutes had passed since she'd seen him bending to drain energy from the dead man. In that brief time, he had changed out of all recognition. Where there had been withered cartilage, there was now ripening muscle. The map of his arteries and veins was being drawn anew. They pulsed with stolen life. There was even a sprouting of hair, somewhat premature perhaps, given his absence of skin, on the raw ball of his head. None of this sweetened his appearance a jot. Indeed, in many ways, it worsened it. Previously, there had been scarcely anything recognizable about him, but now there were scraps of humanity everywhere, throwing into yet greater relief the catastrophic nature of his wounding. There was worse to come. He spoke, and when he spoke, it was with a voice that was indisputably Frank's. The broken syllables had gone.
I feel pain,
he said. His browless, half-lidded eyes were watching her every response. She tried to conceal the queasiness she felt, but knew the disguise inadequate.
My nerves are working again, and they hurt.
What can I do about it?
Maybe some bandages.
Bandages?
Yes. Help me bind myself together.
If that's what you want.
But I need more than that, Julia. I need another body.
Another? She said. Was there no end to this?
What's to lose?
He replied, moving closer to her. At his sudden proximity, she became very anxious. Reading the fear in her face, he stopped his advance.
I'll be whole soon. And when
I'd better clear up, she said. averting her gaze from him.
When I am, sweet Julia.
Rory will be home soon.
Rory, my darling brother. How in God's name did you come to marry such a dullard?
She felt a spasm of anger towards Frank. I loved him, she said, and then, after a moment's pondering, corrected herself. I thought I loved him.
How can you have believed that? He's a slug. Always was. Always will be. Never had any sense of adventure.
Unlike you.
Unlike me.
She looked down at the floor. A dead man's hand lay between them. For an instant, she was almost overwhelmed by self-revulsion. All that she had done and dreamed of doing in the last few days rose up in front of her. A parade of seductions that had ended in death. All for this death that she had hoped so fervently would end in seduction. She was as damned as he, she thought. No fouler ambition could nest in his head than presently cooed and fluttered in hers. Well, it was done.
Heal me, Julia. Heal me, please.
I will. I promise you, I will.
And then we will be together.
She frowned. What about Rory?
We're brothers under the skin. I'll make him see the wisdom of this. The miracle of it. You don't belong to him, Julia. Not anymore.
No, she said. It was true.
We belong to each other, Julia. That's what you want, isn't it?
It's what I want.
You know, I think if I had you, I wouldn't have despaired. Wouldn't have given away my body and soul so cheaply.
Cheaply? What do you mean?
For pleasure. For mere sensuality. But in you, I see.
Here he moved towards her again. This time, his words held her. She didn't retreat.
Julia, in you, I might have discovered some reason to live.
I'm here, she said without thinking. She reached across and touched him. The body was hot and damp. His pulse seemed to be everywhere, in every tender bud of nerve, in every burgeoning sinew. The contact excited her. It was as if, until this moment, she had never quite believed him to be real. Now, it was incontestable. She had made this man, or remade him, used her wit and her cunning to give him substance. The thrill she felt touching this too vulnerable body was the drill of ownership.
This is the most dangerous time. Before now, I could hide myself. I was practically nothing at all. But not anymore.
No, I've thought of that.
We must be done with it quickly. I must be strong and whole, at whatever cost. Julia, do you agree?
Of course.
After that, there'll be an end to the waiting, Julia.
The pulse in him seemed to quicken at the thought. Then he was kneeling in front of her. His unfinished hands were at her hips, then his mouth. Forsaking the dregs of her distaste, she put her hand upon his head and felt the hair, silken like a baby's, and the shell of his skull beneath. He had learned nothing of delicacy since last he'd held her, but despair had taught her the fine art of squeezing blood from stones. With time, she would have love from this hateful thing, or know the reason why.